Peter McDonald, who is professor of English and related literatures at Oxford, will be speaking on creative absent-mindedness, and he will be in conversation with Jon Cook, who is professor of literature at the University of East Anglia. The theme of this session is the limits of storytelling in academic disciplines and the sense of place.
I'm Jon Cook, by the way, not Peter McDonald, and I'm going to briefly introduce Peter in a moment. There's also, though, something else to say, and that is that we had hoped to be joined today by Professor Saikat Majumdar from Ashoka University in Delhi, but in a fit of creative absent-mindedness or absent-mindedness, he missed his plane. So he won't be joining us, but he has sent a text which I may quote from when it seems relevant to our conversation, which is going to be a conversation certainly about or against storytelling by way of the work of James Joyce. And as always, I'm delighted to introduce Peter McDonald to you, who's going to be leading this session over the next few minutes. Peter is a professor of English and related literature at the University of Oxford and a fellow of St Hugh's College. He writes on a wide-ranging set of themes: literature, the modern state and freedom of expression, the history of writing, systems, cultural institutions and publishing, multilingualism, translation, and intertextuality. His major publications include British Literary Culture and Publishing Practice, 1880 to 1914, which was published in 1997, a fascinating study of South African writing called The Literature Police, Apartheid, Censorship, and Its Cultural Consequences, published in 2009. And most recently, I think the book that he'll be referring to or drawing on in what he's going to say today, a book called Artefacts of Writing, Ideas of the State and Communities of Letters from Matthew Arnold to Zhu Bing. He's currently also working on an international research project into the history of pen and linguistic rights and human rights. And in his work, as I've encountered before, there's a hope for something that he very interestingly calls creative criticism. So it's a great pleasure to introduce him today, Peter McDonald.
Thanks very much. It's a real pleasure to be here, and thank you to Marie and Grant and Ev and everybody who's made all the practicalities possible. Amit has always struck me as somebody capable of intuitions beyond his plans and intentions. And in this particular one, I can only attribute to him a kind of mystical Svengali-like power, because the connections, this of course sounds like one of these classic things of people thrown together. We did not talk about what we were going to talk about before. We knew roughly what the theme was, but I couldn't think of a better way of, a better act to follow than Jeremy's, because it just prefigured so many of the things that I want to talk about in terms of the palpability and materiality of language, the capacity for certain forms of writing and literary writing in particular to unweave us from the language that he says via Heidegger we're constantly woven into. And there are genuinely, I was struck by the connections, and I really hope we can elaborate on them in this session. So I have just a few things I have to say. I have to apologize for the fact that there is a PowerPoint here, but you will see that this talking about what I want to talk about is impossible without you in terms of the materiality of language. There's also a kind of a sensory aspect of language without you recognizing that there's a whole way of relating to language, which is through our eyes. So it's vital that you have to look at this. In fact, it's a problem when I start to try to say certain things. But when Amit said to me, I wanted to come and talk at this against storytelling session, I immediately thought of the ultimate work against storytelling that has had an impact on me, which is James Joyce's Finnegans Wake. And it's, in a sense, for me, as a reader who stumbled onto Finnegans Wake as an undergraduate and then sort of fumbled with it for years and then wanted as a graduate student eventually to write something about it, and I've only now finally 20 years later managed to do something like write something about Finnegans Wake or in response to Finnegans Wake. But for me it always was there as providing a kind of welcome escape from the kind of dominant Euro-American literary traditions, which today, as always, have been dominated by a kind of a narrative and character writing. And if you want an antidote to that, then it's a little bit, it's difficult to find one that's more extreme than Finnegans Wake, an antidote to that kind of writing. So that's always been the appeal. But as I've lived with it for 25, 6, maybe 30 years now, it's also done a number of other things for me. One is it's constantly defined and shaped my angular relationship to my own discipline. My host discipline is literary studies, and I've always had an awkward and angular relationship to it for some of the reasons that Amit was talking about earlier, that there was a tradition of critique in my field, which I felt always uncomfortable with. It didn't seem to me much point in being a literary academic if you spent your entire life taking apart the object of study, not in a sense of just analytically, but actually wanting to somehow destroy it and not recognize in some way and support and be an ally of its creative potential. That seemed odd as a career choice, and it wasn't one that I wanted to make, but most of my colleagues did, and I felt slightly unhappy with that. But in another even more mundane sense, and I really want to reiterate this because I know most of us, including me, are afraid of Finnegans Wake. In even a more mundane sense, Finnegans Wake always made me think that my own host discipline was never literary enough. And that's what I want to partly talk about. And that is one of the key connections to what Jeremy was saying. It depends what, of course, you mean by literary and what that relationship might be. That's the one side of it. The other side of it, however, is it's also, Finnegans Wake has always kept me unmoored from my own discipline and, in fact, sort of floating about in a world of academic disciplines, of many other academic disciplines, not because I want to, but because, as I hope I'll try to show you in a moment, Finnegans Wake forces you to do that. You cannot, if you're an academic, stay happily in your own discipline and think about Finnegans Wake. It will push you into other areas. So those are some of the things that I would like to talk about. The pressure that it puts on my own discipline, pressure it puts on me, the pressure it puts on us as readers who are maybe first versed in the English language, but equally the pressure it puts on academic disciplines and the formations of knowledge. So therefore something that might be worth talking about in your institute, which is committed to questioning the notions and processes of disciplinary knowledge formation and how that works. So the title, of course, as I'm sure you've all realized now, comes from my title, Creative Abcedmindedness. There's a typo, but it's not a typo. It's a quotation. My title comes from Joyce's Finnegans Wake, and the specific passage I'm alluding to is for the work that is most famously known as being unreadable. My title comes from the moment at which it is its first reading lesson, which is on page 18, and it's this rather endearingly imploring sentence. And I will read this one out. Stoop, if you're absent-minded, to this clay book. What curios of signs. Please stoop in this aleph bed. So, one of the things that starts to happen with Finnegans Wake is if I read that out, stoop. If you are absent-minded, if you don't have that in front of you, you might think I'm saying, just sort of oddly or just mispronouncing slightly, absent-minded, which is what most people want to say is there. That's why I'm saying it keeps me unmoored, maybe unhinged is the better word, in terms of disciplinary formations. You're constantly asked to absent your mind and its way it's been trained from what's in front of you. So maybe it's that. A lot of more facetious people will hear absinthe-minded. That's also possible. If you've got a bit of Latin, abcedere, to withdraw, to move away, to shrink from. Joyce is definitely anticipating that's going to be the main reader's response to his work. If you are stoop, if you're shrinking away. Abcedere. But of course, the key thing that's there is a play on A, B, C, D, E, the first letters of the Roman alphabet, and hence the alphabet. And when I say that Finnegans Wake is reminding us, it makes me in particular, within literary studies, think that my discipline is not literary enough, it's because we don't deal with writing enough as a medium, and the way we relate to writing as a medium, which is primarily, in the first instance, if we're readers, through our eyes. In other words, it's a visual medium. It's not a verbal medium. It's not our encountering with language in some abstract sense. It's the way we encounter this thing called book language through our eyes. And Joyce is insisting on that at every moment. Reading, in a sense, begins with knowing your letters. And things are not as simple as A, B, C. That's one of the things that he's suggesting. And so the curios of signs that you're asked to engage with, I'm just going to give you one example. And I'll just, this is a sense of which, again, how it works. Again, I'll just leave it for a moment for you to look at. And then I'll have a go at reading it. Before I read it, I will just give you a little bit of context. Not that it helps, but actually, in terms of this topic that Amit wants to talk about, one of the things that is interesting and odd about Finnegans Wake is a lot of the detail and the triggers for a lot of the detail were actually tiny little stories that people told him, especially from his father. Little anecdotes, stories, little storiettes. And they are often in the background of what's going on, but it's of course been worked up way beyond that little storiette. But there were little oral stories often. And in this case, it actually comes from the woman who became his wife eventually. They married for technical reasons much later in life. Nora Barnacle, as I'm sure you all know, and which Joyce's father said, well, at least she'll stick to you. Nora was telling about, this is from the ALP episode, if those of you know Finnegans Wake, the Anna Livia Pluribel episode, 1/8 of Finnegans Wake. And it actually was triggered by an anecdote about Nora talking about her early sexual experiences, and it's to do with paedophilia and priests in Ireland. So if you want to, at some buried in this episode in the background, there's either a pedophilic priest lusting after a young girl, the young ALP, it's recounting her sexual history, or it's a thirsty priest wanting to drink from the river Liffey, because the Anna Livia Pluribel is both the river Liffey and a potential kind of female principal. Again, we can't call her a caricature, but she's something like a female principal running all the way through. Okay, so if I tried to read this, I'm going to voice it in one way. There are many ways in which you voice it, but I will say, Mass, but the magic Wavis has Elphanan on meshes, and Simba the slayer of Isolde is slewed. We could, and here we are just dealing with the issue of not being literary enough, not engaging with writing as a medium. We could say, this is just an set of odd English sentences. And we could try to parse it like this, which gives us something Mass. For those of you who know your river names, there's lots of river names in the ALP episode. That is the Maas is a river in Holland. Maas, but the magic waves, we could read it as that. We're again turning these into recognizable English words. The magic waves now again, as a way of dealing with the ancient word anon, the kind of old form word anon have childlike, elfin as childlike entanglements. So you can, again, think about the paedophile priest, possibly, where meshes is used figuratively. And Simba, the slayer of his ogre, is slewed. So you could do that. However, one of the things that Joyce wanted to do, and this is something that he did increasingly over the 17 years in which he wrote this book. For me, one of the questions about Finnegans Wake has always been the most basic one. Why did this wonderful, obviously brilliant writer decide to devote the last 17 years of his writing life to this essentially mad book? Why did he do that? Something really had to be at stake for him to devote this and to suffer the consequences in his lifetime of writing this. Why did he do that? So one of the things that the Wake wants to do is to make you absent yourself, either from yourself as a monolingual reader woven into one language and possibly encounter the multilingual self that you might also have to start to hear other languages and see, via seeing and then hearing, other languages in what's in front of you. But the other thing it wants you to do is to stop being and stop living on your own, to collaborate, to read with others. And if you start to do that, if you start to encounter this with this text with others, you will suddenly start to see and hear very different things, depending on the linguistic competence of the people you're with. Now, with these particular 3 sentences, it will make a huge difference if you happen to be sitting next to a Kiswahili speaker. Because that speaker will tell you very quickly that entangled in these apparently English words are a whole series of Kiswahili words. And in fact, there's a couple of Yoruba words thrown in as well. So there's a very powerful Africanized element to this. And they will point out to you that Maji, M-A-J-I, Maji in that sense. Of course, Joyce is working with the history and the oddity of the fact that we spell magic, M-A-G-I-C, but pronounce it magic as if it's M-A-G, so that's a better phonetic spelling in many ways. He's also aware of that. But Maji, Wavu is net, Ilfu is 1,000, Oga is timid or wash. But also, when you start to do this, and somebody who's from the East African coastline will also tell you that Simba is a river. It's another river name thrown in. The Simba Uranga is part of the Rufiji Delta, now, what's now called Tanzania. But Simba is also the Kiswahili word for lion or warrior. Pick up those words. And then if they are Yoruba speakers, they'll also pick up on the Oba as a river in Nigeria, but also that she's the goddess of Yoruba goddess of rivers. And Oga is also Yoruba for chief or boss. It's a very common Yoruba word to say, yeah, my boss told me, my Oga said I must do this or do that. So if we do that, if we have that translation, we're sitting with that kind of reader, or you suddenly have a productive stroke and discover the Kiswahili speaker that was buried in you, and you can suddenly see that, then we could parse the sentence very differently, these sentences very differently. Mass, but the water net has 1,001 meshes, and Simba the slayer of his Oba is lewd. We could parse it like that. I won't dwell on this. We can. The Wake is something that you can talk about forever. It's what it's designed to do. But I will only point out one thing, and that is that in the way that it wants to work, and the text wants to work, is once we have seen Elfun Anon. If you go back to Elfun Anon, not Elfun Anon, but Elfun Anon, you then suddenly realize with the Kiswahili word Elfu 1,001, it's 1,001. So once we start to do that, then we're suddenly invoking the Arabian Nights. Once we start to do that, then suddenly Simba the Slayer sounds a little bit like Sinbad the Sailor. Once you start to do that, then you start to wonder even other possibilities might come into mind. Simba the Slayer, Shiva the Destroyer, it's not just Arabian Nights, it's a Hindu world that's being invoked. Okay, this is what goes on. This is what Finnegans Wake generates and how it works. But notice that we're all working from the visual graphic medium, and then it can be sounded in very different ways. So if I say Elfun Anon, elfenanon, as opposed to elfunanon, we don't get the 1001 without the translation. So what we start to get is something like this being invoked through those sentences. And one of the greatest homages to Finnegans Wake is Salman Rushdie's The Satanic Verses. And there's one particular figure. The figure is a 7th century poet. He's both a surrealist of a Joycean kind on his kind of really creative days, and on his other days, he's a satirist who gets himself into all sorts of trouble, the poet called Baal. And at one point, the narrator, a narrating voice in Satanic Verses, describes Baal in his surrealist mode. And it's one of the many moments, there are many ways in which Satanic Verses alludes to the wake. It's one of the moments in which this is a pretty good description of what the wake does. Chimeras of form, those like Majik, Wavus, Elfenanon, chimeras of form, lion-headed, goat-bodied, serpent-tailed impossibilities, whose shapes felt obliged to change the moment they were set. I think it's a very good, interesting description of what Joyce is doing. However, having said that, for reasons that will become apparent, I think it's better to think about it like this. So that, in other words, the key thing is that with the wake, and this is one of the things that we could maybe talk about with Schoikot in his piece talks about the wake as a lot of people think it's to be read out loud, it's to be sounded. I think it's absolutely crucial to remember that Joyce is recognizing that he's changing our relationship to writing in the first instance visually. Of course, it can be then sounded out in infinitely various ways depending on your competence and background as a reader. So the grapheme is fundamental. But the key thing for Joyce is that the grapheme will not lead in any systematic or let alone one-to-one way to one phoneme, one meaning, one language, or one tradition. That is broken. That relationship is changed. And that is a disruptive relationship of how we are trained. Even as orthographic, expert, adult orthographic readers, we're forced by the wake to become novices again. How do we say this? We don't know. We've got to go back to those really elementary skills of reading. It's not complicated. It's doing that. Okay. So, yes, I mean, I did want to slightly invoke John Lennon's Imagine, which is, I've always thought Yoko Ono read Finnegans Wake, and that is really Yoko Ono's song. Imagine There's No Heaven. Joyce is, if you wanted to put a popular song version of Finnegans Wake, I think Imagine is pretty close to it. A little sentimentalized slightly, but a version of Finnegans Wake. Imagine there's no heaven. There's no heaven in that sense of moving beyond the grapheme to some single, defining, fixed sound, meaning, language, or tradition. If I put it like that, then it does sound like this is a book that is really for literary professors and crossword enthusiasts. And yeah, it is that, but I think, again, the way in which the wake has constantly forced me out of my own disciplinary comfort zones and into other disciplinary areas where I've had to go, just following it, is that this aspect of writing, our relationship to writing, the way we are taught as readers of the alphabetic writing system to think about it, to connect graphemes to phonemes, etc., that breaking that relationship for Joyce there was much more at stake than simply experimenting with words, having fun with language. And there's one particular moment, which is I'm going to end with, where he makes this very, very explicit. I will read this out. You can see the infusionism is spelled correctly, so it's the doctrine that the soul is a divine emanation infused into the body at conception or birth, and capnomancy, spelled in the standard way, is divination by smoke. The voice speaking here is a voice of the newly independent. This is first drafted in 1925, first published in 1925, 1922. It's the newly independent Irish Free State. It's a voice talking on behalf of that collective and talking critically, in a sense, about what Joyce is doing and what the Finnegans Wake is doing with language. And the voice says, concedes. Now, capnomancy and infusionism may both fit as tight as two trivets. In other words, they fit together. It's essentially, infusionism is divination by smoke. The idea that the grapheme is infused with the phoneme that's divination by smoke. But while we, in our we free state, holding to that pre-statute in our charter, this is the key thing, may have our irremovable doubts as to the whole sense of the lot. This is the sense of history, but it's also the sense of Finnegans Wake. The interpretation of any phrase in the whole, the meaning of every word of a phrase so far deciphered out of it, however unfettered our Irish daily independence, we must vaunt no idle dubiosity as to its genuine authorship and holus bolus authoritativeness. So yes, James Joyce, you may be playing all sorts of games with language and challenging us and disturbing us, but we will never renounce our belief in the fundamental authority of the state that we have just created. The pre-statute in our charter, if I give you that, you'll get a little sense of what's at stake in this particular passage. This, by the way, comes from a section of the Wake that is the longest section that is all about how to read the Wake. It's book 1.5, otherwise known as the Mamafesta section. It's about ALP's text that she produces. This is the pre-statute in the charter that's probably explicitly being referred to, but it's actually, because it comes from a revision later on, the second one of the Irish Republic in 1937 is also there. I'll just read it. So Dale Aaron, sitting in his Constituent Assembly in this provisional parliament, and this is the bit, acknowledging that all lawful authority comes from God to the people, and in the confidence that the national life and unity of Ireland shall be thus restored, hereby proclaims. That's the opening preamble of the Constitution of the Irish Free State. In the days of Brexit, it sounds a little different. Joyce is very open to the fact that changing historical circumstances will make words sound and look very different. But the bit that I like the most, and I think that Joyce was fully aware of, is De Valera's text and opening of the Constitution, which is still the opening of the Irish Constitution. For Americans in the audience, you'll spot the allusion at the bottom, but it's interesting that unlike the American version and unlike the Indian version, which came later, 10 years later, it doesn't begin with we, the people. It begins with, in the name of the Most Holy Trinity, now no longer God, but the Most Holy Trinity, from whom is all authority, and to whom, as our final end, all actions, both of men, and the bit I like the best is the plural, and states, must be referred. So this is not simply a theological conception of the Irish state. It's an infusionist and theological conception of all states is being articulated there. This is the pre-statute to our charter. So for Joyce, that way of thinking about writing, that infusionist model, has ramifications into all sorts of other spheres: theological, political, philosophical, linguistic. It goes on and it goes on. And the Wake encompasses them all and challenges them all. This, just to make things worse, this book, Artefacts of Writing, that I'm talking about, when I was talking about it, when I was writing it, over the few years I was writing it, people asked me what I was doing, and I said, I'm working on a book about Finnegans Wake and UNESCO. And the standard response, especially from academics, was, oh, Finnegans Wake at UNESCO. And I couldn't believe that I actually got it. No, and I said, no, UNESCO, the organization. And so it is about UNESCO. And the reason it's about UNESCO and Finnegans Wake is that I trace the UNESCO, of course, I see as a multi-state organization, but it's an interesting, conflicted multi-state organization where it's also trying, as an autonomous organization, to push the states to think in certain sorts of ways, itself as an organization, but it's always ultimately answerable to the member states. And that's part of the history of UNESCO that fascinated me, particularly to do with questions of how you conceptualize language, culture, and community, all those things. And there's a long history. It's an extraordinary, now 70-year plus archive of debates about all these terms within UNESCO, and I engage with that history and think about that history. And the bit I liked best is that in 2007, having failed, I'll just give you a tiny bit of background on this, having failed to get a viable concept of cultural diversity articulated by and defended by the member states in the 2005 Convention on Cultural Diversity, basically because it was hijacked in the absence of the United States, which had removed itself from UNESCO under Reagan, was still at that point removed, but it came back partly to resist this particular move. The French and Canadians hijacked the debate about cultural diversity and turned it into essentially a debate about media diversity, which was primarily directed against US domination of audiovisual media. It's a long-running French, in particular, led debate within UNESCO about essentially what Jacques Lang called American imperialism, cultural imperialism. Anyway, that particular convention failed from UNESCO's internal point of view to articulate a viable, in other words, legally binding commitment to cultural diversity in the way that it wanted to, and instead was coded and was really all about media diversity. Because they failed, they did what UNESCO always does when they fail at things, is they organize another congress. And they gathered together a group of really interesting international academics in Venice in 2007 to say, look, what we want to do now, having failed to do this, we want to put together, and they put together a wonderful book on cultural diversity in 2009. We want you to advise us on what will be a viable concept of culture and language, to how to articulate this. And it's a long, they're very aware of the fraught history within UNESCO itself. And this is what three academics from very different backgrounds, Munir Fashe, Neville Alexander, and Mola de Cunha, different intellectual backgrounds, they articulate things like this. Culture, says Fashe, culture is like a river flowing through vast areas and giving life to people. It changes all the time, although we go on referring to it if it were the same river. The most important issue is to avoid reification, to move along the grammatical continuum from substantives towards verbs, in order not to mask what is becoming. Neville Alexander. What is truly specific in a society is not how much people's values, beliefs, feelings, knowledge, lifestyles, etc., as the way in which all these characteristics change. So over 70 years after Finnegans Wake was published, UNESCO, but not the member states, finally caught up with Joyce. Thanks very much. I think, yeah, it is.
Yeah, good. Well, thank you very much, Peter, for that entrancing talk in many ways. While you were talking, and I was thinking about the relationship to, or my relationship to Joyce, one of the things that came to my mind, which I'd forgotten about, was laughter. And it's very difficult to read sentences from Finnegans Wake without laughing. And I wondered whether in this work on Finnegans Wake you'd come to an understanding of the particular characteristics of Joycean laughter and what the effect is of laughter in Joyce's work.
Yeah, I mean, it is, Joyce in Ulysses, in fact, makes use of a coinage which a lot of people attribute to Joyce, but actually it was Samuel Johnson who came up with this neologism, which is the word joco-serious. So it's a form of, it's a word that says that it's neither comic nor not comic. In fact, what is disturbing in the kind of comedy of Joyce is whether or not it's supposed to be funny or deeply serious, and it'll never ever allow you to resolve that. In a sense, what I hope, well, there were some moments of levity, I thought, people, but there are always, certainly with Finnegans Wake, those moments where it really works like a joke. in a sense. With some of them, you suddenly get it. Some of them are straightforward puns. I mean, they are puns, but most of them are portmanteaus, where they're linking things and talking with somebody, and somebody, you can suddenly see it, and there can be this flash, and it can be like getting a joke. But the great thing about the Wake is that even in that sense, the jokes just keep coming. They don't stop. But the other thing is that I think is vital to it is that you're never ever on secure ground as to whether this is just one huge elaborate joke, or is perhaps, in terms of, say, the history of Euro-American thought, one of the most profound exercises in literary writing that's ever been produced. So never being able to settle that is, I think, part of it.
Yes, I was wondering about the extent to which it was also connected to the particular kind of emancipation that seems to be being, we're being invited to participate in through this kind of language, this kind of working on and in and with language. Yeah. Whether, well, it's connected to all sorts of thoughts that take me back to what you were saying about the state. There's a famous sentence by Alexander Herzen when he's thinking about comedy, where he says only equals may laugh. Okay, that comedy has an equalizing function, that it has the function, amongst other things, as Bakhtin has shown, of dethroning authorities, of putting them into question, of mocking them, of deriding them, and so on and so forth. And Joyce, I mean, reading Joyce, I remember obviously from Portrait of the Artist onwards, one of the things that both grips and horrifies and torments Joyce's imagination is the seriousness that goes with a certain kind of nationalism and a certain kind of religiosity, as though the weapon against that seriousness is laughter at some level, is people's capacity to laugh, and in laughing to laugh at themselves too. I mean, I was wondering whether there was any connection to be explored there.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you raised the whole issue of equality and laughter in that sense as well, because that's also really, really interesting, because it is, again, in the way that I think, this book ends with the contemporary Chinese artist, wonderful contemporary Chinese artist, Xu Bing, and it ends in particular with two projects of his. One is called Book from the Ground, and the other one is Book from the Sky. And the Book from the Sky is 4,000 unique and utterly, that he designed, utterly illegible pseudo-Chinese characters. And the Book from the Ground is actually what I have on the cover. That's kind of emoji and pictogram, all found emojis in pictogram novel. Essentially, it's like Ulysses, a day in the life of a loser. It's what this narrative tells. It's a kind of issue about storytelling. So the one is forbiddingly exclusive. No one. If you know Chinese, you think you should be able to read it, but you can't. If you don't know Chinese, you think it's Chinese and you can't read it. The other one is supposed to be open to everyone. And in a way, I end with that partly because I also do make connections. Unfortunately, the book makes connections constantly to Finnegans Wake. I do make connections to that. The Wake, in a sense, is both at the same time. Both forbiddingly exclusive and open to everyone. It's wanting to do both. But it is, of course, vital. And I think there's also a way in which I'm always slightly hesitant to go down the line that a lot of people take with Joyce and to position him as a fierce anti-nationalist. He was deeply skeptical throughout his life about the idea of trying to revive Gaelic as a language. He thought that was never going to work, that it was a kind of a curiosity. It would only survive as a curiosity. He just didn't think that was linking the project of nationalism to the language project. He was skeptical about. History sort of both proved him right and wrong. It is still actively learnt in Ireland, Gaelic, by everyone, spoken by far fewer. But at the same time, he is extremely concerned about the ways in which forms of nationalism, what's happening now, the resurgence of it now, those exclusive forms of nationalism. He is extremely concerned about that. He thinks they all have fascistic tendencies. He's particularly worried about forms of the nation that are defined by the state and by state elites that will want to try to fix it in a certain way and define it in their way, the ruling state elite, whoever they are. So that for Joyce, it wouldn't be so much the phrase nation-state is not correct. It's better to put it the other way around. It's a state-nation. Who controls the state and who then defines the concept of the nation. But having said that, Finnegans Wake is, in a certain way, deeply anti-nationalist. That's true. But it's also a book that is firmly rooted just to go link to Schoikot, firmly rooted, and I make links to Tagore in this respect in the book as well, firmly rooted in a particular place. It is still deeply rooted in Dublin. In fact, it's rooted in a particular suburb of Dublin. And that aspect of that rootedness, but it's rooted at a point in Dublin and a moment in Dublin where it is on the River Liffey, and the River Liffey flows into the sea. Everything flows into Dublin from the sea up the Liffey. Everything flows out of Dublin from the Liffey out to the sea. So that it's at the same time affirming a sense that we are all finite, we all begin in a particular place, but it'll never be just our place, because others will always have been there before, and it'll never be just our place because we'll be constantly in traffic with others. The way in which Joyce picks up on this and makes it open, and this is possibly also, I really did want to say these three words in this context, in this place. His son sent him a telegram from the United States on the 4th of July, 1935. And he sent a reply in saying it's totally gratuitous throwaway remark at the beginning. It's just about family business. But the opening remark is, thank you for sending me your telegram on Independence, Dependence, Interdependence Day.
Would people like to ask questions now, or hear a little bit from Schoikot on Joyce? Well, I think it's better if I decide. Are there questions that people want to raise? Yes, Amit. And then, do you need the mic? Yes.
Yeah, that was wonderful, Peter. I just want to link what you said about Finnegans Wake to Jeremy's talk. So Jeremy, one of the things you spoke about was the editor. And Jeremy wanted to write journalistic pieces which were not journalistic in the sense that they were privileging writing and certain aspects of literary writing over giving information and telling a story in the journalistic sense. So Jeremy got to know about this fact that he was not doing what he was supposed to do from the editor. Mm-hmm. And the editor said to him, we want a balance of information and other stuff. We want a bit more of information, and we want it to be shaped into a kind of story. But this is not to say that if the editor hadn't spoken, that Jeremy didn't have his inner editor. So the absence of story is not about an absence of an editor. We are creating a kind of narrative where a different sort of editor is at work. We are leaving out things and putting in things. They may not satisfy that editor, the one that Jeremy worked with, but they are being done according to the requirements of this other editor, who is indistinguishable from the writer or the producer. And Joyce is definitely such an editor. Joyce is moving right from Dubliners onwards on this kind of path where certain things are being left out. Even in capacious books like Ulysses, the pressure comes from things being left out, including the impact it has on grammar and syntax and the syntax of storytelling. What's interesting in Finnegans Wake is we know things are being left out. We are being encouraged to think everything is being put in even more a kind of almost ideological way than Ulysses. In Ulysses, what's being left out is becoming kind of clear to us from the disjunctive shape. We don't think you spoke about the mistake of wanting Ulysses to be Finnegans Wake to be read out. It's also a mistake to think that if Finnegans Wake is the result of a person who's just doing what he feels like and putting in what he feels like from these bursts of inventiveness. But on what basis do we see the editing over here? What's being left out?
So it's a huge question. But the one thing I would say right at the beginning, which is one of the ways in which I just couldn't believe what Jeremy was talking about at the beginning, was that where you said, the first thing you said about your editor was they want to be able to look through the writing. You know, that whole impulse. And of course, for all of us, I mean, that is the natural, well, it's not natural, it's what we trained and what we are acculturated to do, is of course we will instrumentalize writing. We will go to it to look through it, to get what we can from it, to take something from it. That of course is completely normal. And you know, I'm not saying anything against that. What's interesting, I'm interested in the kinds of literary writing that do impede that process, and ideally they don't impede it just gratuitously. I mean, it's an imposition, an interference that is radically justified in some way that we have to work with. But the most extreme form of writing that I've personally ever had to deal with and encounter is Finnegans Wake, in that sense, qua writing, that sense of, you know, you cannot go through this, you cannot see through this, because you just can't. It's how it's designed. But it's not opaque, utterly opaque. There are ways of making it momentarily transparent in one direction and another, so on. But what's interesting, Amit, in terms of your question, and what is perhaps also something, it's why Finnegans Wake, I should declare myself and say I'm not a card carrying, and not, I would probably be frowned upon by Joyceans. I'm not a Joycean in that sense, but I love the work and use the work of the Joyceans a lot. And what's interesting when you look at the kind of scholarly formations and how knowledge gets produced and so on, the Wake has more or less now almost entirely become an object of genetic scholars, people who are interested in studying the creative process. And they have done extraordinary work on the manuscripts, on the notebooks. I mean, when you start to see the notebooks that Joyce worked from, the coded forms of notebooks, snatches of little partial words that he's jotting down, and then he has these multiple color schemes for what's gone in and what hasn't got in and crossed out and this and that. It's a coded system that's impossible to work with, and these people spend their lives, thankfully, uncoding all of this stuff and helping us track it through. But the basic situation is actually really interesting, and it's the opposite of exactly why I was thinking of what Jeremy was saying. It's exactly the opposite of what he was asked. The creative process for Joyce is about moving away from the possibility of it being readable and transparent. It's about constantly thickening it up. So he, for instance, every revision and so he constantly publishing bits. I was talking to John about, there's the bit about the Constitution it appears in 1925 in T.S. Eliot's Criterion magazine of all places, and it appears there as a fragment. But it's when you read it there, it is fairly transparent. It's fairly readable, and it's definitely in English. And what happens is that as he works on it, as he goes through these drafts, he's both piling in more and more languages, first of all from within the purview of Europe, but then by the time he gets to the late 30s, it's world languages. And it's definitely more and more African languages coming in, Indian languages coming in. He's throwing in those words. It's just thickening up all this. So the interlingual portmanteau playing just gets ramped up. So it's precisely, in a sense, in terms of his inner editor, it's about him evolving over 17 years, where it's actually a fascinating. It is. I can see why the genetic scholars, and that's why I love reading their work. It is a fascinating process to watch somebody, in a sense, do the opposite of what a normal editor would expect, to make it more and more a thick medium that you have to work with, and that is going to point and open up in multiple directions, not less and less.
Yes.
A question about, I don't think I need the microphone, but you talked at the beginning about the way in which the Finnegans Wake unmoors you from the discipline.
Yeah.
But and you talked about graphemes, and they made me think about the graphosphere. And I was a reader for Cambridge University Press, very, very large learned book, which I assume will come out, on Slavonic scripts and Slavonic languages, and all types of writing that are non-narrative, that comprise the graphosphere from the medieval period probably to the early 20th century.
Yeah.
And I didn't feel particularly qualified to review the book, because although I knew the contents and the scripts and whatever, the term graphosphere as a discipline, as a discourse field of study didn't really mean very much to me. But I wondered actually whether it's something that's now perhaps your new home, or whether it actually means anything to you, whether there's an area of study called the graphosphere that comprises non-narrative, non-literary writing, for which something like Finnegans Wake would be a marvellous mirror, I suppose. Just
yeah, I mean it's a great question, and yeah, it's a big question. So in 1952, Ignatius J. Gelb coined a phrase which somebody famous, as many people I'm sure in this audience will register, didn't pinch. He alluded to it and used it, and the word was Gromitology. In his study of writing, a book, Gelb's book in 1952. So that was, there's the study of Gromitology. One of the things that interests me in it is something that I'm taken back to my, it's exactly what exactly the same things that Jeremy was talking about have happened to me because of reading The Wake. I go back to the most basic moments of my formation in terms of when I learned to read. What books was I taught? How was I taught to read? What was I related to? What was the language that I was being introduced to? Those really basic questions. I'm being thrown back to that. But I'm also fascinated, as indeed Derrida was. By the way, Derrida read The Wake at Yale in the 1950s, and you really cannot understand of Gromitology if you don't know where he's coming from with that. I mean, there would be no Gromitology in my view without Finnegans Wake. I can put it bluntly. But the thing that interests me is how within linguistics there was Gelb made the statement in 1952, nothing happened. Derrida then came out and took it into philosophy, essentially. And sort of Derrida happened. But then in 1985, there was the beginning of a study of writing within the field of linguistics, and recognizing that this had been marginalized as an area of study, but it's really gone nowhere. I mean, there are fantastic books that have been written, but mainstream linguistics sails on. Absolutely, basically ignoring writing. They maybe have a half a week's module on writing for their students. That's basically not at all. It's a minority interest. But what interests me is what does it say about us and academic discipline? It's not only that. I also talk to cognitive neuroscientists, learn a lot from them. I talk to cognitive psychologists who are a slightly different breed, and I learn a lot from them. But what's also really interesting is for both of them, in those areas, coming to terms with writing and reading is a new thing. Not just about language acquisition, language development, which they've studied for years, but actually starting to think about writing and reading as specific kinds of cognitive activity. This is a very new thing. It's within those fields. So it's also slightly marginal still within those fields. So linguistics, philosophy, cognitive sciences of various kinds, and of course literary studies. Why is it that we don't spend enough time teaching our students in literary studies, say for instance, the basics of the writing system? Where did it come from? How does it work? What are the principles on which it's constructed? Why is it that you can say the word write and write it down 4 ways? What does that tell you about what are words? What is writing if it's not actually mapping onto sound? Yes, of course it is. We have a phonetic system, but we don't think about the ways in which it's also not phonetic, and it's working in other ways we need to think about. And of course, poets and writers are consciously and unconsciously working with this all the time. You just have to use rhyme, and you're immediately doing something with the visual and the acoustic side of the writing form. But so I'm interested in the reason why this still remains peripheral. And it's almost, and I know this is an exaggeration, but it's almost the same reason as to why we don't want to confront Finnegans Wake. Why we feel alienated and push it away. because it's confronting something about how we construct knowledge, what part writing plays in that, and asking deep questions about those sorts of things, which we just are still shy of.
So is there a branch of literary studies called the graphosphere, or that you know of?
There are a couple of eccentrics pursuing projects on certain graphic dimensions. Certain forms of book history and book historians have, but they also don't, on the whole, think about this. They are more interested in paper and binding. No, than graphic marks. But they're interested in printing, of course. Yeah.
Time for one more question. Does anybody want to?
It's always Finnegans Wake. You can always rely on Finnegans Wake to put people into stunned silence.
What are the four rights?
I don't think I've worked it out.
Sorry, I didn't hear that.
So there are four ways to say rights. R-I-T.
Okay, come on. Say.
What's the fourth one?
So give us your three.
Like a series of rights of passage, R-I-T-E-S.
Yeah.
Of course, the right, R-I-G-H-T, the right to do things, or the right hand, maybe that's the two you need, as well as W-R-I-T-E. Is there a fourth one?
W-R-I-G-H-T? As in a wheel right?
Yes.
A real right, W-R-I-G-H-T? So R-I-T-E, R-I-G-H-T, W-R-I-T-E, and W-R-I-G-H-T.
Oh, I see.
Choice we find. Okay.
That's why my book is punningly entitled Artefacts of Writing.
Yeah. Good. We need to finish this session, and I think there's going to be a break of 10 minutes. We'll reconvene at 5:30. And Peter, thank you again for a wonderfully